Hey everyone, and welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're doing something a bit different. We're stepping away from the massive abstract spreadsheets and graphs to conduct a really focused investigation into a deeply human reality. We're going to uncover exactly who the poor are by looking closely at the characteristics of both rural and urban poverty. Poverty isn't just a single blanket condition that looks the same everywhere. It's got highly specific demographics, distinct geographical faces, and systemic traps. So let's look past the raw data today and uncover the actual lived human realities behind those statistics.
Here's our briefing docket for today. First up, we'll break down the 7 universal traits of poverty. Second, we're going to define the poorest of the poor. Third, we'll build a profile of the rural poor. And finally, number 4, we'll build a profile of the urban poor.
All right, Section 1, the 7 traits of poverty. Let's dive in.
Now, look at the sheer scale represented by this number, 15.2%. That brings us to our very first primary trait of poverty, which is hunger and malnutrition. The source material hits us with this absolutely startling statistic. Roughly 15.2% of the world's total undernourished people live in India. So when we talk about poverty here, we aren't just talking about a lack of cash in the bank, right? We're talking about a fundamental biological deficit, where millions literally just do not have the required food to sustain basic health.
And building off of that severe malnutrition, let's quickly walk through the remaining 6 overarching traits that compound this daily deprivation. First off, impoverished populations have few, if any, income-earning assets. And, without assets, there's absolutely no safety net. That ties right into the next trait, which is physical weakness. Because of ill health, disabilities, or serious illness, which are heavily worsened by that lack of food we just talked about, just being able to work becomes incredibly difficult. Next, there is a distinct lack of basic literacy and skills, which effectively locks people out of better opportunities. Then you've got a total lack of basic amenities. We're talking no safe drinking water and no electricity. Add to that the reality of large family sizes, which just stretches already incredibly thin resources to the breaking point. And finally, because of all these overlapping factors, the poor are often forced into high-interest borrowing from local moneylenders, dropping them straight into vicious, unbreakable debt traps.
When you actually see this reality visualized, it really grounds all those abstract traits we just listed. You see a family here, father, mother, multiple children, which perfectly represents those large family sizes stretching resources thin. You can visibly see the physical toll of disease and emaciation, hammering home that physical weakness and lack of food. You see the heavy chain of illiteracy, literally described as a life sentence. And finally, you see the lack of what's called puka, or permanent houses, emphasizing that total absence of shelter and basic amenities. It's basically all 7 traits converging on one family's daily survival.
Moving on to Section 2, the poorest of the poor. Let's slow down for a second and look at the most vulnerable group here.
I want to highlight a very precise definition directly from our source material. The poorest of the poor include homeless people who reside on common lands. And the gravity of this is profound. They lack even 2 meals a day. They are suffering from chronic, unrelenting hunger. But what's really crucial to understand here is the demographic breakdown of this group. The text explicitly points out that women, female infants, and the elderly within poor households fall strictly into this category. They are systematically the absolute most deprived individuals within an already deprived environment.
All right, Section 3, Profile of the Rural Poor. Let's see how geography changes things.
To really understand poverty, you've got to understand where it lives. Over 3/4 of poor people in India reside in villages. 3/4. That means if we're genuinely going to understand the true face of poverty, we have to look closely at the rural environment, because that is where the vast majority of it exists. So who exactly are the rural poor? Well, the source gives us a very clear profile. They are landless agricultural workers who have to toil on other people's property. They're small and marginal farmers desperately trying to survive on totally inadequate plots of land. They're rural artisans, think weavers, potters, blacksmiths, whose traditional trades are really struggling to compete. And they are largely made up of backward classes and backward tribes. Now, because they lack basic literacy and are geographically so isolated, they simply can't find alternative employment in the non-farm sector. They're effectively tied to an overcrowded agricultural system. And because they are tied to that highly unpredictable agricultural system, without any assets to fall back on, we hit one of the absolute grimmest realities detailed in our source, the debt trap. Just to survive, or even just to buy seeds and fertilizers for the next season, rural workers are forced to borrow from local moneylenders. And since they lack collateral, the interest rates are totally exorbitant. This leads straight into chronic indebtedness. The text specifically points out the tragic extreme consequence of this cycle: poor farmers committing suicide when they completely fail to pay back these heavy loans. It's a fatal, systemic trap.
Let's switch gears and look at Section 4, Profile of the Urban Poor.
When poverty moves into the city, its face changes entirely. It shifts away from agriculture and straight into informal service. The urban poor reside in highly vulnerable, overcrowded slum localities and possess practically zero assets. So who are they? The text lists them out very specifically: rickshaw pullers, street cobblers, pushcart vendors, and rag pickers. They are petty self-employed persons, domestic servants, extremely low-paid factory workers, and beggars. Essentially, the struggling rural farmer becomes the urban pushcart vendor. The rural artisan becomes the city rag picker.
But there's a specific, systemic barrier that is completely unique to the urban poor. Unlike the rural poor who get trapped by agricultural moneylenders, the urban poor are trapped by a total lack of vocational education and training. Because they don't have specialized skills, they have absolutely zero leverage. The source explains that this lack of leverage prevents them from being able to negotiate even their basic, legal wages from their employers, and the result of that, total exploitation in the urban labor market.
Putting these side by side perfectly illustrates our entire investigation today. The environment completely dictates the struggle. On the rural side, you've got isolated villages, a massive reliance on agriculture and traditional artisan work, and that fatal trap of moneylender debt. Meanwhile, on the urban side, you've got vulnerable, overcrowded slums, reliance on informal vending and service labor, and the trap of wage exploitation simply due to a lack of vocational training. The occupations and the settings completely transform, but those underlying 7 traits we started with, the malnutrition, the lack of assets, the illiteracy, those remain exactly the same.
Which brings us to our final thought for today. We've seen that poverty isn't just a monolith. It wears the face of a landless farmer in an isolated village, and it wears the face of an exploited pushcart vendor in a crowded slum. So if poverty takes on such incredibly specific geographic forms, how on earth must our solutions adapt? A single one-size-fits-all policy clearly isn't going to cut it. How do we design strategies that can dismantle the rural moneylenders trap while simultaneously addressing urban wage exploitation? It's a massive, massive challenge, and one that makes the study of poverty alleviation absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep asking these tough questions.